Hi, my name's Josh Taylor, and I'm here with my colleague Lauren Avellon, and we're from Virginia Commonwealth University's Rehabilitation Research and Training Center. And we're going to talk today about evidence-based intervention to promote the competitive integrated employment of individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities, what we know in research, policy, and practice. So to give you a general overview of the agenda we have for our brief talk, we'll give an overview of the current situation with competitive integrated employment for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities, and then really get into a summary of what our work encompasses. So this work has been conducted with funding from the Rehabilitation Research and Training Center on the employment of individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And specifically the reviews that we'll cover of the research fall under the first research study. So it really kind of guides a lot of the work in this area. And we'll talk about 4 specific areas of evidence-based intervention and pathways to competitive integrated employment. First, we'll look at a comparison of integrated versus segregated vocational services provided to individuals. Second, we'll look at internships as a specific intervention model for transition age youth. Third, we'll look at post-secondary education and the impact of some of those programs on employment outcomes specific to CIE. And last, we'll look at the cost-benefit analyses of employment services, a different way of looking at benefit, both in terms of benefit for the employee and also for sort of a taxpayer. So before we get too into our work, I think it's really important to provide a rich context for understanding really the problem that this area represents. And so kind of what we know, kind of big picture to frame this issue, is we know that youth and adults with disabilities have very high rates of unemployment, and partly because of this are more likely to experience persistent poverty through the course of their lives. We know this across the spectrum, but these outcomes are even worse for those with intellectual and developmental disabilities, including autism spectrum disorder. So we see that, occurring over the last several decades in the research. And so here we have an excerpt from a recent report that shows specifically for youth and young adults with autism spectrum disorder, some of the rates of employment that are experienced. So in the first box, you see that only 14% of individuals with autism had a paid job in the community. And so this is what we typically define as competitive integrated employment, which we'll talk about throughout our presentation. And that really represents the gold standard of what we're aiming for with the research, policy, and practice. That's the target or the goal for all individuals, to have a job within their communities, earning at least minimum wage, sustainable wages, and everything like that. So we see only 14% are achieving that goal that has been established by recent legislation, and really is the goal of that. In the second box, we see that 42%, so a much larger percentage of this group of individuals with autism, participate in unpaid activities within facilities. And so when we talk about those facilities, what we mean is facilities or organizations that are totally segregated from people without disabilities. So these are focused, these can be day programs, shelter workshops, and really these these in particular occur without pay. Oftentimes they seek out waivers called 14C fair wage waivers that allow for sub-minimum wage. But in this case, 42% are in day programs where they receive no pay at all, totally segregated from people without disabilities. So a real problem. And then 27% of this group in this particular report were not engaged in work at all. So totally disengaged from any kind of activity, whether it was facility-based, whether it was for pay or not for pay. So totally disengaged. So that's a huge chunk of this group of individuals that is really disengaged from what we want to see as far as employment outcomes for everyone. So kind of what we see, again, working age adults with intellectual disability, like those with autism, have really strikingly low rates of unemployment. One estimate puts the rate of employment kind of overall at about 34% of those that were considered working age by this particular report, which was ages 21 to 64. And of those, more similar to what was reported by the Autism Indicators report, only 18% in a competitive job. So earning a sustainable wage, above minimum wage, in integrated work environment in a business alongside coworkers without disabilities. So those numbers are very, very low. And that's kind of what we see across the board, is that we see about 10 to 20% of those with intellectual and developmental disabilities are achieving that goal of competitive and integrated employment. And this is really significant because, you know, over the last several decades, there's been a tremendous amount of research and policy, as well as legislation, both at the federal level, most recently through the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, which was passed a few years ago, that really kind of across the board for vocational rehabilitation and federal funding, really put competitive integrated employment as the central goal of that funding. And then we see it also in state plans that emphasize what we call employment first. And so the employment first really represents a commitment on the part of state and state agencies to achieving this competitive integrated employment as a main goal. And so we see a lot of activity in a lot of those different areas of research, of policy, but it's not affecting the actual outcomes, at least so far from what we've seen. So this is really kind of a problematic situation. And so we can see this chart really clearly shows sort of the progress, or really lack of progress over the last several decades. So you can see that black section at the bottom is integrated employment or competitive integrated employment. And again, that's what we're aiming for. And what we see is really, you know, a really lack of progress in that, and a plateau, certainly over the last 2 decades, and really very little growth of those with intellectual and developmental disabilities served over that time. And so you can see in the section just above that, we have seen a little bit of a decrease in those engaged in facilities-based work. And so those in segregated environments that are often receiving sub-minimum wage. But as you can see clearly from this graph, the main group that has grown over this time, unfortunately, are those that are not engaged in work at all. And so we're seeing a lot of the individuals with intellectual and disabilities just totally disengaged, and are not being plugged into services that are giving them access to the outcomes that we'd like to see.
So I just want to summarize what Josh so nicely has kind of put in front of us here in terms of what the empirical literature base tells us about employment outcomes for individuals with IDD. Clearly, there's room to move the needle in terms of providing better outcomes for individuals with IDD in terms of employment. And so we really wanted to focus the body of our work, which we'll discuss further as we move forward through this presentation, in terms of what we know about evidence-based pathways to create competitive employment for individuals with IDD. And I think the distinction that's really pertinent here that Josh mentioned is that we're really looking, again, for competitive integrated employment. So we want to look for outcomes that are commensurate wages to individuals without disabilities, that are in integrated settings, that offer comparable benefits, and that are, again, competitive within the community work base. So we want to make that distinction between other non-work-based outcomes. And I'll mention this a little bit later, but sometimes in the reporting of the literature, that's not explicitly clear. So we'll do our best to kind of separate those two, and Josh will lead into that nicely with the first study. So to give you kind of an idea of what our projects were, we did a scoping and systematic review of the body of literature in different particular areas that relate to employment for individuals with IDD. So rather than doing one large investigation, we ended up with subcategories to help parse out different evidence-based pathways and other relevant topics. We wanted to provide a really systematic or rigid approach to this in order to get the most empirical findings. So we followed what we call a PRISMA method. And that really helps with finding the highest efficacy of interventions. And so that'll be something that we really delve into as we move through this presentation. So Josh mentioned this earlier as well. This project was created through funding from the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research. And the overall goal was to map these different topics and then create tangible products that we could deliver to other researchers, practitioners, just the general public, in order to give them utility in the information that we found so that they could use it in their day-to-day professional lives, or for those who are individuals with disabilities that are looking to seek employment services, could have a better understanding of what might be particularly effective for them. So there were 4 areas that we focused on. The first one is integrated versus segregated services. The second one is internship programs. And those are particularly related to individuals that are involved in K through 12 and transitioning out and utilizing services in an applied business setting. So not the same as work-based experiences, but pretty lengthy and involved participation in an internship model. And then we also are going to talk a little bit about post-secondary education. So there are programs specifically for individuals with ID, and we wanted to know what impact that has on employment outcomes. And then lastly, we wanted to talk a little bit about what the cost benefit is for individuals that participate in competitive integrated employment. And then also what the cost benefit is to the general public. So there's kind of a dichotomy there in terms of overall beneficiaries. And we wanted to really look at who is able to access kind of an advantage from participation in that. So the PRISMA model is the methodology that we employed. Again, that's a really rigid format for looking through the different literature bases. And those different literature bases are peer-reviewed and also gray literature. So peer-reviewed would be, of course, empirical databases that have other scholarly individuals who have combed through that and agreed that it certainly provides important information to the literature base. But then gray literature is also important entities that didn't go through that peer-reviewed process. So that could be government websites, could be white papers, it could be organizations that specialize in certain disabilities. So again, we look through all these databases using the PRISMA method, which the PRISMA method stands for the preferred reporting items for systematic reviews and meta-analyses. So it's kind of a mouthful, but again, we applied that in order to get the most representative sample of the most informative sources of information. And then we expanded that process a little bit more too. So we actually reached out to consult with experts in the different areas. So the post-secondary education, we contacted several individuals that have extensive experience working on those types of programs. We also combed through the literature to find individuals that were really knowledgeable about cost benefit, and so included their consult work in informing our findings and also our review. And then lastly, we used all of this information to really analyze the findings and again, translate them into that tangible product that we could report out to you, which one of those is, of course, this seminar today.
So the first of the series of reviews that Lauren's talked about that we'll highlight and talk about and share our findings related to is what we've kind of coined the integrated versus segregated review. So just kind of go back to those 4 guiding kind of research areas. This one is really looking at comparing what the research shows us about the outcomes related to both services that are provided in those segregated vocational models. So as we operationally define those as shelter workshops, adult day rehabilitation centers. And so those are ones that, as we saw in some of the earlier slides, introducing the overall context of employment for folks with disabilities. Those are often where individuals are receiving subminimum wages. And so this is a significant and persistent group of those who are receiving these services. And again, this is despite competitive integrated employment being set as the goal of policy and certainly research over the last several decades. So we talked a little bit about the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act that really established for the first time in federal legislation CIE or competitive integrated employment as the that preferred outcome. So really this gives guidance to state agencies and others who kind of follow that legislation to really be aiming for that. And so related to that, we really wanted to revisit the literature. There had been some previous literature reviews that had been conducted about 20 years ago. There were a few of them. And at that point, they found no evidence supporting any kind of positive associations between these segregated services and sort of preferred outcomes. When we talk about those positive outcomes, we're talking about better wages, better job stability, better job satisfaction, employer provided benefits, all the kind of good things that we would expect to get out of a job. So when we talk about positive employment outcomes, that's kind of what we're talking about. So these previous reviews had found no positive connections between these. And when in studies that had compared more integrated models like supported employment and customized employment that really fundamentally were based on an integrated model that involved training, providing training and support to an individual in an integrated work setting, it found that those segregated ones really just didn't match up in terms of the outcomes that they provided for individuals. But because we saw this persistence, even since these literature reviews were conducted, we still saw in that earlier chart that while they declined some, we still saw tremendous amounts of individuals that were served in these types of settings and received subminimum wages. So we felt that it was really important to go back to the literature to look at whether there was any evidence or what the evidence would tell us about those who receive these segregated vocational services and how that linked to positive employment outcomes. So that was kind of the first and primary research question of this literature review. And then the second was looking at, once we had assembled that literature that provided evidence to support or to counterindicate some of these services, how did that compare to what we knew was shown from the integrated vocational literature? So from interventions like supported and customized employment that provided supports in a more integrated setting, how did those match up in terms of the outcomes they were associated with related to financial benefits like wages and benefits, but also in terms of health outcomes, in terms of personal independence, and in terms of establishing kind of a career based in competitive integrated employment for individuals. And so, what we found, the kind of primary finding and most important one that we really want to highlight is that our review found no evidence in support of segregation of the segregated services. And remember, that's operationalized as shelter workshops, adult day programs. So we found no evidence in support of those programs and services as a method for improving employment outcomes as we operationalize them. So this included both in terms of establishing pathways to competitive integrated employment. So in other words, having previous training in those segregated services didn't help individuals to later have better outcomes down the road. So even if we looked sort of longer term, they actually had a negative effect on individuals eventually earning competitive integrated employment positions. And then we saw this also for wages, for hours, for cost, for quality of life, for independence. We found no association between any of those positive benefits and those segregated services. And then when we looked at the second research question, what we found is when we compared the two, those integrated vocational service models led to higher wages. They led to higher cost efficiency in terms of the programs themselves and how financially sustainable they were. The higher levels of control for the individuals, so they had more sort of the component of self-determination, of locus of control over their lives. And they had improved self-esteem as well related to this. And so to unpack this a little bit, obviously, having such stark findings between these two models really serves first and foremost to strengthen that commitment that we talked about in policy. While WIO has established this kind of clear goal of competitive integrated employment for individuals with disabilities, our study shows that is the right path, and we should maintain the commitment to that path for individuals, as well as sort of state-based initiatives and legislation around employment first. From a practice perspective, obviously increasing the use of those more integrated models like supported and customized employment for individuals that may require more support needs in a workplace to develop skills and to sustain employment. And then, related to that, decreasing and eventually ending the transition of youth from schools into adulthood, their transition into those segregated settings. So, we really want to make sure and sort of pick up the call of previous researchers in this area that those who are transitioning from school should really be linked with some intervention or pathway, whether that's post-secondary education, which Lauren will talk about in a little bit, or one of those service areas, service models that directly leads to CIE. And then we also see that there's a need for future research in this area, more around sort of the systems change efforts. So as states and communities sort of look at the service models and the service providers that are available within those communities, how can those service providers sort of make that shift from providing sort of that more segregated model, which we know is not going to lead to positive outcomes? How can they shift and evolve and provide services and link individuals and families with services that are going to lead to those better outcomes? And that's some of the research that we need to better understand right now. We're seeing some of it starting to come out in states like Rhode Island and Oregon that have been subject to executive actions through the Department of Justice and things like that. And then obviously we need to sort of continue to rapidly phase out those 14C waivers, are those that authorize subminimum wage. So a really damaging practice that not only keeps individuals in that persistent state of poverty, but also sends a message to employers about the value and worth of employees with disabilities that is not accurate and doesn't reflect their value to the economy and to companies.
And I'm going to talk a little bit about one of those pathways to competitive integrated employment. As we've mentioned, a lot of legislative agendas have really begun to push employment first, so those non-segregated work options, and really integrate and make employment competitive. And so we've seen a lot of that. WIOA, as Josh has mentioned earlier, is one of those in particular that's really pushed funding towards pre-employment transition services. And particular 15% has been allocated to transition age youth to try and increase post-school outcomes. And that's really getting at providing funding and more opportunities for work-based learning experiences. In other words, opportunities to really get into community businesses in applied settings and get skills for job tasks, and also gain a better understanding of perhaps vocational preferences. And some of the ways that work-based learning experiences work is career mentorship, job shadowing, and internships. So this particular review focused on internships. And for the purposes of this review, internships was defined by the US Department of Labor. And I think it is an important distinction because it needs to be separated from some of the other work-based learning experiences that are kind of short experiences out in a community business. In contrast, internships really are more time intensive. They vary in duration, but can take up to 12 months, 9 to 12 months sometimes. And there's really a collaborative effort among multiple stakeholders to provide this opportunity. So I presented some of the criteria there and just to kind of cherry pick. So it involves job site training. It is with the intention of an educational benefit. So what's noteworthy there is that there is no guarantee that employment will be the result of participation in the internship in that particular business. And it also doesn't displace other employees. So again, the individual who is an intern is not considered an employee. It's again, really an educational experience. And they can be paid or unpaid. It really varies depending upon the model. So really the focus of this was to just look at the evidence base within the peer-reviewed literature to get an understanding of what types of internships have actually been investigated. And so those research questions really target, of the ones that have been investigated, what level of evidence in terms of methodological rigor is offered so that we can deduce from those findings how effective these internship programs are. So level of evidence in education is very different than other disciplines. It's kind of an aggregate of many different types of research methodologies. So of the highest rigor is randomized control studies and then meta-analyses of those, followed by more quasi-experimental, correlational, and then case study research. And so with each level, you have a different strength of evidence to report with findings. And again, education has a lot of difficulties over, again, other disciplines, like maybe a medical model where most research is happening in applied settings. And so you don't have as much control over variables. Usually the primary focus is to provide an intervention or service to an individual rather than research. So we do get a lot of varying types of levels when we scan through pertinent information on topics like internships. And so we just really wanted to assess, again, what level of evidence is available to inform findings. And then of course, that's related to the impact of employment outcomes. So not only job status following exit of an internship, but some of those quality indicators as well. So how much are those individuals making? How many hours are they working? Again, being at an internship site means there's a host business that is taking you on. So if you're an intern, you're not employed there. So we also wanted to consider how many of those host businesses then later employ individuals that were previously interns. And then lastly, we wanted to think about what internship characteristics really led to the efficacy of the intervention. So were there any themes across the different models that might help us determine what particular components promote CIE over other ones? So there were 4 main models that were identified. And again, these are internship models. The first one is Project Search. The second one is Project Search plus Autism Spectrum Disorder Supports. So it separates itself from the traditional Project Search model because it includes diagnostic-specific supports for individuals with ASD. The Bridges program, which is originally founded by Marriott Bridges, sometimes those terms are used interchangeably. And then lastly, an internship model called Start on Success. So these were the 4 that really emerged in the peer-reviewed literature. Again, we use that PRISMA model. So the peer-reviewed databases were scoured through to find any pertinent topics related to employment for IDD and internships. And in the end, a total of 20 articles were found. And again, those 4 internship models were the only ones represented among those. So in terms of the findings, with the first one, just looking at level of evidence, overall, internships did become a predictor of post-school employment for individuals with IDD and other disabilities. So generally speaking, we did find positive relationships between that participation and later outcomes. In terms of level of evidence, the Project Search plus ASD supports model was really tested at the highest level of rigor. It involved 4 randomized control studies, excuse me, with one of them being in a multi-site. So not only did they have really effective outcomes in terms of employment, that particular model really had high level of evidence to support those findings. And those findings in terms of employment status ranged anywhere from 60% to 90% of the internship models in terms of later employment. So that's significantly higher than what we see for individuals that aren't in some of these avenues to competitive employment. And then also, because we talk a lot about the competitive aspect, these three models, Project Search plus ASD, and the Bridges model, they all had at or above minimum wage earnings. So they're really delving into that competitive aspect in terms of wage. The Start on Success model isn't mentioned here because it didn't provide outcome data in that capacity. But certainly for future research direction, that would be something to navigate. And then another important finding for employment outcomes is that individuals that were in internships, particularly the Project Search plus ASD model, ultimately who found themselves needing job support services in order to become employed, needed far less hours, so on-site services, in order to become employed. So that really acted as a stepping stone, that internship, in terms of preparation for later paid employment. Some of the internship characteristics in particular, we noticed that all of them adhered to kind of a supported employment model. Again, there is a business immersion component, so all individuals are learning these skills while in the business setting. They're using job support, training, follow-along services, job development for internships. So those themes are really consistent among the models. And again, those models had pretty high efficacy rates in terms of transition to employment. But again, one of the other aspects of the internships is that they are really time and resource intensive. Again, 9 to 12 months for most of these. And in terms of actual hours, they're there for full weeks at a time. So we really know that while this is a great model to consider for transition age youth, it definitely requires a lot of stakeholders and time and money to produce. And then lastly, just a few themes that are noteworthy from the literature. There's quite a few populations that are particularly vulnerable to poor employment outcomes. I'll skip down to the second bulletin point there, minority populations. The Bridges model was highly successful and almost exclusively targets minority populations. And so for that particular subgroup, these findings are pretty informative to help those individuals transition to competitive employment. And then also military connected youth. So the Project Search plus ASD model was implemented with this subgroup. Again, highly effective in terms of outcome status for employment. And military connected youth are kind of an interesting sample because they experience a lot of extraordinary challenges. For example, they often have to relocate. So they're getting a disconnection in services. And so sometimes they suffer from having inadequate transfer of records or harder ability to access specialized education services, or just some of the familial stressors with being military connected, like having separation from a parent or family member who is deployed. So this particular population definitely is underrepresented in the research. And again, the PS plus ASD model was highly successful in helping these individuals with employment. And then of course, the diagnostic specific supports. I mentioned this earlier, the PS plus ASD model was demonstrated as effective at the highest level of evidence. And so that was an exclusive sample of individuals with autism spectrum disorder. And as Josh mentioned earlier, individuals with autism spectrum disorder have particularly low rates of employment compared to other diagnostic categories, working less hours and earning less wages. So to have information regarding what is really useful for them is a good finding. And then lastly, I just wanted to note about that first bullet under applicable populations, was that we did find a study that looked at individuals who are already in sheltered workshops and who use the Project Search model in order to try and transition to CIE. And what they found was that while overall the search model was effective, it was not effective for individuals who had been in segregated sheltered workshop settings for more than 5 years. So extended stay in a shelter workshop seemed to really mitigate the effects of the internship. Some of the implications here for internships is just that we really do have a pretty emerging strength of evidence in terms of internships as a whole. Particular internship models like the Project Search plus ASD supports already have a pretty strong evidence base. And so providing continued funding and directing it towards this type of work-based learning experience is important. And then also continue to involve adult service agencies. So a lot of times these internship projects, again, involve multiple stakeholders, one of which is adult service agencies who often provide job coach training on site or even other ways, funding or maybe transportation to the internship site. So specifying the role of these service providers and continuing to have them involved is really essential. And then with future directions, we definitely want to progress the research agenda. So the project search model had the highest level of evidence. The bridges model and the traditional project search definitely did have a body of strength of evidence, but progressing those up to more stringent methodological rigor. So moving from, let's say, correlational type research into more randomized control studies, true experimental designs would be useful in terms of providing more information. And then clarifying CIE versus work. So we did notice that among the studies, a lot of reporting was a little ambiguous. So we definitely want to know if the outcomes are related exclusively to competitive integrated employment, or if work in general is being reported. So that could be a mix of competitive integrated employment with also non-work type activities or segregated work activities. So in terms of reporting in the research, we want to make a clear distinction among those. And then some of the other things that are still up for investigation include level of staff training. A lot of the studies didn't really thoroughly report how well or in what capacity staff that were providing services, maybe on the job site, were trained and in different areas like behavior supports, for example. We also know because these internships are time intensive, do they necessarily need to be that time intensive? So altering the dosage might be something to consider. And then finally, extending out some of the employment variables in the research. So we definitely looked at whether individuals were employed and then hours and wage, but also we want to look at other quality indicators like, do they retain jobs longitudinally? How long does it take following exit of the internship in order to attain employment? Do they have upward mobility? Are they in varied industries? So we really want to make sure that in the research we're as moving forward as practitioners really presenting an outline for this type of thing so that we can make sure that we're understanding fully the effect of internships. So to employment is the post-secondary education. And these are varied programs for young adults with intellectual disability, and they operate on college campuses. And that can be really in a varied type setting. So four-year institutes of education, sometimes community colleges. The Higher Education Opportunity Act of 2008 really paved the way for these types of opportunities. They provided funding for demonstration projects called TIPSIDs. And prior to that, there were comprehensive transition programs. So this idea is not new, but it's really been advanced a lot in the last decade since HEOA came out in 2008. And the types of programs vary in terms of level of integration with other students on campus. So I've mentioned they're integrated, hybrid, and separate. So the integrated programs are really for individuals with intellectual disabilities that take college courses and participate in all activities on campus with other students that have that do not have disabilities. And then the separate model is really substantially separate from other college students. So often these individuals have separate classes. So it would only be with other individuals that have intellectual disabilities, and maybe their applied work experiences are again somewhat separated. And then finally, there's a hybrid model that's kind of a mix between the two, where there is some integration with coursework, and then maybe some of the classes are integrated and some of them are not. And then lastly, with these programs, aside from just level of integration, they differ a lot in terms of credentials offered. Sometimes there's a certificate of completion rather than a college degree. They also differ just in terms of length. So there's a lot of variation among these programs. And in relation to employment outcomes, because the primary objective of providing these opportunities was to improve post-secondary outcomes for students with intellectual disabilities. So once they leave these college classes, to really have better outcomes in terms of employment, but also independent living and some other aspects. We wanted to look at within the literature and see what impact it's had on employment specifically. So we looked at employment outcomes and also transition to employment procedures, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. Then also research methodology, which I've covered kind of extensively under internships. So the same basic idea was applied here. So we used, again, that PRISMA model to comb through the research. For post-secondary education, we looked at both peer-reviewed and gray literature. So all sources were collected. And essentially what we found was that all programs, for the most part, involved coursework and applied work experience. So they really had kind of an educational didactic component that related to employment specifically and teaching employment skills. Sometimes social, sometimes direct actual work, sometimes testing work preferences, but then also an applied experience. So they had what would be similar to an internship experience, either on or off campus, but in an actual business. And so we did see that, again, across all of them, they really did target employment specifically in terms of training and focus. And of the 12 articles that were included in the final sample, we found fairly high rates of transition to employment. There was 50 to 91%. However, that's only half the sample because not all of them did report employment outcomes. Lastly, we looked at, second to lastly, we looked at follow-along services. So after an individual leaves a post-secondary education program and is faced with finding work out in the community, what supports were put in place by the post-secondary education program? And what we found was that there was very little reporting among studies on this. About 2 to 3 of them actually gave detailed specifics on the type of procedures they had in place. And then lastly, there were no randomized control designs, so that level of evidence was really limited to lower tiered research. So the findings, of course, can only be analyzed in the context of kind of a research agenda that needs to be progressed in the future. So just to sort of summarize the implications of these findings, the literature base did support the idea that PSE is a pathway to employment. There's a lot of implications for future direction, both for practitioners and researchers. We definitely need a lot greater deal in reporting variables. So some of those things I mentioned earlier, whether students are graduating with college level degree credit or just a certificate of completion, and how that impacts employment. Again, I mentioned research methodology. There's a lot of room to sort of create more rigorous studies to get more support for findings. Just like for internships, we want to expand those variables out. So not just employment status. That was largely the focus of post-secondary education reporting, was whether or not students obtained work. We didn't see a lot of information on quality, like how much hours they were working per week, what they were making, what industries they were represented in. So we really want a better understanding of kind of the quality of employment outcomes. Similar to internships, collaborator roles is important, in particular that follow-along support. So we didn't see a lot of information about what services were in place for adult agencies that would provide vocational support. So clarifying the collaborator roles, particularly for adult service agencies, is essential. And definitely continued funding. And then again, I mentioned the emphasis on follow-along support. So overall, there's really an emerging evidence base for post-secondary education, but we have a lot to do in terms of moving the needle for this particular pathway.
And our fourth and final area of review that we'll talk about is our cost benefit review. So when we talk about cost benefit, what we're looking at are those analyses that really examine, the cost of services in terms of how much, to put it colloquial, kind of bang for the buck individuals get or taxpayers get in terms of the outcomes that are bought through that investment. And so when we look at cost benefit analyses within this area, they typically break down into two areas or two different types of analyses. And those are looking at sort of the taxpayer perspective. So in terms of the use of public funds, what are the outcomes that we get for each dollar spent of taxpayer money? And then also through the individuals. So the individuals in terms of their time, their resources that are invested in certain approaches to employment, and then how that compares or what the kind of ratios that balance that out with the outcomes that are received from that. So to put in context just a little bit of the scale of what we're talking about when we look at sort of the financials of employment for people with disabilities, a recent GAO study a few years back, the Government Accountability Office found that there were 45 federal programs in the United States that in some way promoted the employment of people with disabilities as part of the scope of their work and what they were intended to do. And that totaled $4 billion each year. So just a massive investment of money across a lot of programs that each have different criteria that define who a person with a disability is, who a job seeker is, or working age person, that define differently what the goal of those services are. And so what we see is just a patchwork landscape of policies and legislations that in some way contribute to this area of employment with people with disabilities. And kind of the other part that we believe that sort of led towards the purpose of this review is that, as we've talked about in the context of a couple of our other reviews, this establishment of competitive integrated employment as a preferred goal of the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act and several employment first policies really places a need for better understanding those cost benefit of services. And so if we're really defining the scope of all this investment as competitive integrated employment, then really we need to have a better understanding of how these different approaches that are funded or that are directed through these federal programs are achieving what we are starting to want to refine them to become, which is competitive integrated employment. But we do have some previous literature reviews. The last one, major one, was conducted in 2000 by Robert Samara. And it found that supported employment, so this integrated vocational model, that especially when using individual placements was cost efficient from both of those two perspectives that we talked about at the beginning. So both the worker perspective and the taxpayer perspective. And so that was really the kind of basis that we looked at the literature since then, and was guided by two primary research questions that looked at sort of different aspects of cost benefit within this area. And so the first was looking at the cost effectiveness or cost efficiency. So there's two analyses of worker and taxpayer from a macro perspective of sort of overall trends in the outcomes for individuals with ID sort of as a whole, right, as a macro. And the other looked at the micro, and so looked at the cost, the duration, the intensity of those services, and how they related to outcomes at the individual level. And so kind of looking at two different ways of thinking about that. And what we found was that, similar to previous reviews of the literature, that community integrated vocational services led to higher effectiveness than shelter workshops did. So the segregated models were not as effective at using funds to achieve those similar gains. Another major finding was that supported employment costs decreased over time. So there was a sort of relatively higher initial cost to provide services related to job training, job development, but those cost decreases as individuals stabilized in positions. The costs specific to individuals with autism were also higher at the beginning, but also declined over time. So that there was a little bit more of an initial cost to develop jobs, to train, to provide those upfront services, but those trailed off over time. And also, specific as Lauren touched on with post-secondary education in this area as well, the costs of those PSE services also decreased over time. And so what we saw was that competitive integrated service models were a better use of public funds and more efficiently provided the outcomes from a worker perspective as well. So from both perspectives, we saw that those services that were integrated were both cost efficient and cost effective. Also, that sheltered workshop participation negatively affected cost benefit. So as we saw pop up in a few different areas, that participation in those segregated services actually had a negative effect. So not only did it not provide pre-training or a little bit some progression towards the outcomes we wanted to do, it actually when we looked at the groups that had participated in that, kind of held them back from what we would like to see them achieve, which is those better employment outcomes. We also think that there's a need for further research and looking at sort of the patterns of those VR services. And so we saw kind of overall groups who received this, groups who received this service. But what we don't have yet is enough research that looks at individuals and how they receive sort of different types of services and how those different patterns of services lead to better outcomes or lead to different outcomes. And then, as Lauren touched on with some of the other areas, we also have a need for more standardized measures, that we have a lot of different ways of reporting costs, different ways of reporting outcomes from those different federal programs that each use maybe different terminology, different criteria. And so that makes it a little challenging to have sort of a standardized way of looking at and thinking about those. So that's something that needs further attention moving forward. And so as we look at sort of, these four separate areas that each in some ways represent different sort of pathways to competitive integrated employment, we can see, just overall support for those community integrated services, whether those are sort of direct services or through an internship or post-secondary education model. And we see those as having much, much better outcomes than those that are providing services in a more segregated manner. Along with that, we found across these four studies, no positive evidence for segregated services at achieving meaningful positive employment outcomes. So that really is an important area to note. Since these are continuing to be funded, continue to be used, that we really find no evidence and really recommend that they be phased out. And one of the bigger things is that these really represent sort of four distinct pathways to competitive integrated employment. So different options for achieving competitive integrated employment. And so related to this, we really recommend this commitment to competitive integrated employment, employment first, and policy and practice be maintained. Along with this, as students graduate and get ready to transition from K-12 settings into adulthood and adult service organizations, really making sure that all of those youth are engaged in some kind of a pathway to competitive integrated employment that has been shown by the research to be effective. So that could either be a direct service model like supported or customized employment, or post-secondary education that will, eventually, down the road lead to a competitive job. We also have a need for more research in a lot of these areas, especially with post-secondary education and internships, where our reviews have shown some initial findings and implications, but certainly as these practices continue to evolve, we have a need for better research that highlight some of the areas that Lauren has pointed out. And then just looking at the service patterns, so as individuals progress through their kind of working careers, how do the services that they receive in different ways through VR and really other adult service agencies, how do those patterns of services and patterns of engagement in different types of activities really impact their career trajectories? So how can we better understand sort of ways that we can provide those patterns of support and sort of overlapping services that may put folks on a better path to success.
So as we continue on with this project in terms of just looking at evidence-based research and pathways to competitive integrated employment, we have a few directions that we'll just key you into, so you can stay tuned as we begin to disseminate some of the findings from these other products. But again, we want to continue working to get this information to different professional networks and people who could really use this with day-to-day operation. And then we want to be able to apply that in a way that is really useful in terms of bolstering the outcomes and rates of employment for individuals with IDD. And then also we are focusing next steps on the implementation of a Delphi study, which is essentially a several round survey consensus type study of different stakeholders, which include individuals with IDD, educators, adult service providers, vocational specialists, just to get an understanding of different types of pathways to employment, like we mentioned, internships, post-secondary education, just to see their perspective in terms of how accessible these avenues are. Are they affordable? Do they find them effective? So just trying to get an overall idea of, so if we know that these different avenues do have evidence-based, how accessible are they to people that really need them? So if you'd like to follow some of those products that we mentioned, we do have a link here that is related to our website. And so we've been posting different pieces of information there, including what we call plain language summaries. So those are a translation of some of these more complex studies into information that any layperson could understand. So somebody that doesn't necessarily have the background in this discipline might also find that useful.
And those make for great share outs, with your networks and stakeholders that may come from different backgrounds that may not be as familiar with the research as all of you, I'm sure, CEC participants, but to share along with others who you may want to provide more information about some of these topics on. So since we're providing in video form, we'll just share our references if you want to track down any of the studies that were mentioned in this presentation. And then kind of as we mentioned before, the study was generously funded by funding from NIDLR. So that's information about the grant as well. But we really thank you spending time with us, and look forward to hearing more from you if you want to reach out to talk more about some of the topics that we've covered.